Hello, everyone. We're just going to go ahead and take maybe another 30 seconds to let other participants join, and then we'll go ahead and get started with our speaker series for the month of April. Okay, the time is now 12:02, and I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Rachel Wilson, and I am the communications manager for the Nez Perce Tribe. I want to welcome you all and thank you for attending the April speaker series, where we are debunking myths regarding the Snake River dams, our salmon population, and those sorts of things. So we appreciate you taking the time to attend today. Today I have with us Shannon Wheeler and Jay Hesse, and I will go ahead and let them introduce themselves.
Thank you, Rachel. This is Vice Chairman Shannon Wheeler for the Nez Perce Tribe. I'd like to welcome everybody back, and those that are your first time, well, thank you for joining and tuning in. Today I have the pleasure of being in Hood River, Oregon at the Tribal Fishco facility. So I am remote today, but it's beautiful being here in the Columbia Gorge and right in the heart of salmon country as well.
My name's Jay Hesse. Thanks, Rachel, for including me in this. It's an honor to be able to share a little bit. So I've been employed by the Nez Perce Tribe for 29 years and currently work in the Fisheries Department, mostly in the research side of things, but help coordinate both status and trends monitoring of fish in the Columbia Basin throughout the Nez Perce usual and custom areas, but also the real-time and strategic operations of hydro systems on fisheries resources.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started. So one of the things that I've heard is that salmon runs are already improving at record rates. I keep hearing, we have record rates. So if that's true, what is all the fuss about salmon extinction? Can you explain?
Yeah, getting folks on the same page in terms of the status of salmon or the abundance of salmon and steelhead returning is tricky. It's complex. There's a lot of different numbers, and you can stack those in different ways. But the bottom line is that the status of salmon and steelhead into the Snake Basin is really dire. Over half of the populations are extirpated. There aren't any fish coming back to those for various reasons. Of the populations that do have fish coming back, most of those are listed on the Endangered Species Act list and are not even meeting those basic numbers for ESA delisting, let alone what's considered healthy and abundant or healthy and harvestable. I guess I'm going to ask for a little bit of patience and try to go Bill Nye Science Guy on you here a little bit and try this out. But historically, in the Snake Basin, there were 1 million spring, summer Chinook coming back to the basin. And so what I've tried to do is this pitcher of water has 1,000 milliliters in it of water. It's full. And if that represents the historic abundance of Chinook, spring, summer Chinook back to the Snake Basin, I mean, that was full. So every milliliter of water represents 1,000 natural origin spring, summer Chinook. And that's what supported in tribal culture, subsistence, and harvest throughout the entire usual and custom area. But where are we at today is really the question that gets miscommunicated. So fisheries managers, so I've emptied the jar now, and that blue line on there represents 235,000 natural origin spring summer Chinook. That's what we're shooting for now as representing healthy and harvestable. So that's way less than what was here historically, and what was the premise of treaty rights, but it is what was recently agreed to by the region, both fisheries managers and the general public, as what we expect to have coming back to the Snake Basin for natural origin fish. 235,000 natural origin fish coming back to the Snake Basin past Lower Granite Dam. Well, for the last 5 years, the average number of fish coming back, natural origin spring summer Chinook, has been 8,000. And so I've got 8 milliliters that represents that in this jar. So the challenge of Zoom and backgrounds, but you can see, so I've got 8 milliliters, 8,000 natural origin. If I swirl it around, I can get it to cover the bottom of the jar. But as soon as I stop swirling, it doesn't even cover the bottom of that 1 liter jar. That's how dire we are in low numbers for the average 5 years coming back, okay? Now, 2022, some of the folks look at the returns last year and say, wow, those were way better than the last few years. Well, there were 16,000 natural origin Chinook that came over Lower Granite Dam, twice as many as the 5-year average. If I go ahead and add 8 milliliters, it's even hard to pour just 8 milliliters. You get too many pretty quickly. Okay, so I have added last year's return to this, and it still doesn't cover the bottom of the jar. So folks can say that was 100% increase from the 5-year average was last year's return, but it's still literally a drop in the bucket. Okay, so steelhead are the same way. They are at really low numbers. The projection, well, let me go back to the spring summer Chinook. We're projecting right now 10,000 to return in 2023. So less than we had last year, and right around that 5-year average, about what we have, maybe covering the bottom of the jar, well below that blue line. Okay, if we talk about steelhead, the run projections for this year are even more scary. They're similar to what we saw, I think, in 2017, and where the abundance of both natural origin fish and hatchery fish did not support non-tribal harvest in the Clearwater Basin. So those returns continue to be just really low. There have been some higher returns of Snake River Fall Chinook, but still not sufficient to delist those from the Endangered Species Act. And sockeye are really on a life support system, and those fish are primarily hatchery origin that returning, and just a couple of hundred natural origin fish. So,
can you reiterate the blue line? What does the blue line represent? Can you just repeat that really fast, please?
Yeah. So this blue line on this jar, being about 25% of the historic abundance back to the Snake Basin, represents the management goal that was established in the Columbia Basin Partnership Phase 2 report. That was a National Marine Fisheries Service, a federal-led effort that was collaborative. It was completed in 2020 and identified abundance-based goals for all stocks of salmon and steelhead throughout the Columbia Basin. And so that 235,000 was identified as the threshold, the bottom threshold for what's considered healthy and abundant returning back to the Snake Basin.
If I could, Rachel, I'd like to add to Jay's comments, which thank you, Jay, for all those comments, and to see a number come back last year that was higher than the previous year. Last year would have been the first return, I believe, of the high spill operations that was agreed to in 2019, I believe. Was it 2019? And so, you know, although scientifically we can't say that, you know, these numbers are going to return in higher numbers because of that, we can say that is what we predicted would happen, is that those numbers would return higher because of the spill. Thank you.
That's
Okay,
still a long ways to go. We'll take those gains, much needed. It gets us off of the zero line. But as the picture, shows, we have a long ways to go, and we're going to need additional gains to get there, different changes.
yeah, thank you. That was really helpful, seeing like the difference. I've never thought about it like in that manner before. So that actually kind of leads me to my next question. So I read somewhere that tribes are unjustly picking on the 4 lower Snake River dams, and that it's actually the fishing, not necessarily the dams, that are to blame for this salmon extinction. So have we just had it wrong this whole time?
So fisheries management looks holistically at the mechanisms that are reducing survival. And I've put together a graphic of the relative impacts of those limiting factors. If you could maybe share that, Rachel. So part of a fisheries management process is to, know what your goals are, but then assess where you're at and then quantify what the limiting factors are. And this graphic is derived from the information in that Columbia Basin Partnership Phase 2 report. And it just shows the relative impacts of different sources of mortality relative to each other. So what we see is by far the largest single relative impact comes from the hydro system, including the impacts of the lower 4 snake dams, but also the 4 lower Columbia dams as well within that. Those impacts are both direct and indirect. They are a result of having fish having to pass through or over 8 dams on the way to the ocean, but it is also a function of the transformed ecosystem. Was once riverine, now 325 miles of reservoir. But what you can see is that there are other impacts. Tributary habitat is the second highest and fairly significant in terms of 20% of those impacts or limiting factors comes in the spawning and rearing areas throughout the Snake Basin. Predation is the third highest in that, and that is a combination of pinnipeds and birds and fish that are either at elevated levels from historic abundance or non-native species that are new to the basin. Harvest, as you asked about in this question as being, a perceived cause by some, is there on the far right and does have a functional reduction in the numbers of natural fish. However, most of that harvest impact comes from treaty-based harvest that is managed on an abundance-based scale. And so we predict the numbers of fish coming back and then adjust harvest rates accordingly. In recent years, that harvest rate has been right around 10% overall on natural origin fish. And keeping in mind that the treaty rates are in historic customs of tribal fishing are anchored on that natural production. And so it's really part of the baseline conditions. So relatively, harvest is just a small part of the problem. And we've been looking at, the largest factor, hydro, as one that needs some necessary changes to it, but still addressing and trying to manage appropriately and reduce these other factors as well.
Jay, could you I'd like a clarification, I guess, for the John Day River and the Tucannon River, which are in similar areas as far as tributary, the headwaters and the difference between those two tributaries.
Yeah.
with the smolt to adult ratio?
Yeah. So we look at assessing the impacts of different factors in various ways. One of the ways that we've tried to assess the impacts of hydrosystem is looking at populations that are in similar habitats. And Vice Chair, the ones that you highlighted there in the John Day and the Toucanon have very similar geographic locations. However, the numbers of dams that the juvenile production and the adult returns have to pass differ in those cases. And so the John Day River fish from that production have to pass 3 dams, Bonneville, the Dalles, and the John Day Dam, whereas the Toucanon population have an additional 3 dams to go by, and so a total of 6 in that. Similar habitats, but the SAR rate, so that's the smolt to adult return rate, so the survival rate from the time that those fish hit the main stem, start to migrate out to the ocean and hit the main stem rivers, whether that's the Snake River for the Toucanon fish or the Lower Columbia for the John Day, and then returning as adults. Those smolt to adult return rates are drastically different from those 2 populations. The John Day fish SARs are about twice as high and are averaging about 3 to 4%, where the Toucanon fish are in the 1% SAR range, where their only really difference is that segment of 3 dams and the altered habitat between those. So that's one of the lines of evidence, one of many, that we look at assessing and attributing sources of mortality to. And so those 2 populations, fairly similar, except for Toucanon has to pass 6 dams, John Day only 3.
So, Jay, so with the total wild and hatchery picture, would that be helpful too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do that.
Let me know if you can see this. Did it pop up?
It did not.
Okay. That's okay. I will get it figured out. But in the meantime, so I do have a quick question from the chat. It says, can you explain in more detail about the tributary habitat? And I'll go ahead and bring that image back up.
Yeah. So tributary habitat is widespread throughout the Snake Basin. So basically that refers to the population areas that exist upstream of the main stem habitat. And so that's where the spring summer Chinook spawn and the juveniles start their initial rearing and before they head to the ocean. There is the full gamut of condition of that habitat throughout the Snake Basin. We are blessed with connection to high elevation, snowpack, wilderness areas for many of our populations. The Middle Fork salmon is one example of that. There's wilderness areas in the Selway populations. There's wilderness habitat managed areas in the Northeast Oregon, Southeast Washington with the Wanaha and Minam populations. So that habitat is relatively pristine with the exception of reduced marine-derived nutrient cycling within those as a result of the lower salmon returns. But we can look at other areas, other populations that have been drastically modified and need habitat restoration, whether that's restored water for flows, whether that's culvert replacements just to allow passage. Some of that is the improvement of past mining effects, so restoring mining tailings and restoring channel complexity within those systems. Some of that is the abatement of sediment inputs from the vast road systems from timber harvest and other activities throughout the basin. So the tribe and others have been actively involved in trying to restore habitat, to improve the productivity of the spawners that do make it back. But we do have examples of where there is pristine habitat in those wilderness areas, and those populations are still struggling. So we use that as an example just to say that we can't just restore salmon and steelhead to healthy and abundant by improving tributary habitat. We have a number of populations throughout the basin that have really good habitat, yet those populations are struggling. That points to out-of-basin limiting factors that have to be improved to maintain those higher levels of return.
Okay, thank you for that. Shanna, did you have anything to add?
No, thank you, Jay, for covering that. I just know the restoration work that's happening out there. You know, we're doing so much of it, and we continue to do more and do what we can. It's just for me more of a simple view of what that tributary, what's in the tributary, and you know, we have the smolts that are coming down 100%. And you know, generally their condition is at 100%. They hit slack water, they hit predation, they hit sediment channels and channelized kill zones and you know, predation, whether it's avian or invasive species, northern pike minnow that are in that system, and then they hit the dam. You know, they hit lower granite. They're either going over the spillway or they're going through the juvenile passage, or they're going through the turbines, which, you know, of course are, you know, the most impactful and detrimental to them as far as injury. Then they get on the other side and they're having to deal with total dissolved gas, and then predation starts up again because they're in another reservoir. And then they have to do that 7 more times to get to the ocean, and are expected to perform at the highest level to swim and search for food out there, nutrients that they need to survive. And if you're not feeling 100%, then, you know, if you're only operating at 70, 50, 30% of your capacity, then it really makes it difficult for those survivals and that cumulative effect to really happen in a negative manner towards these juveniles that actually make it to the ocean. But what are the conditions? So from 100% out of these beautiful tributaries, some of them pristine, others, you know, still needing work. But yeah, that the gauntlet is very difficult on the juvenile smolts out migration.
Thank you, Shannon. So that actually just kind of brings me to my next question. So if we're, in case we're all missing the bigger picture, does our region even need to fight for breaching dams, or does it just need increased hatchery production instead? Like, why can't we just do like self-sustaining hatchery model like they do in Alaska, and then poof, all of our problems can be solved?
I guess I'll take a little crack at this question, because I think it's more about the native spawners that are returning, you know, the natural native fish that are returning to the tributaries in healthy, harvestable, abundant numbers versus hatchery fish that are, you know, don't carry the same, I guess the genetics are, you know, will be, Jay could explain that better than I could, than I can. But I think the natural native spawners is the number that we're truly looking at here, and really working away from hatcheries. So Jay, if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that, the genetic piece, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Vice Chair. Hatcheries were identified early on as a mitigation mechanism a promise, if you will, to make up for the impacts of dams. It was not a surprise that that dams would have a detrimental and sizable impact on salmon and steelhead returns. That was predicted. It was on the table when the dams were proposed, and folks said we're willing to accept those impacts. Not all folks, people that decided to build the dams said we'll take those impacts and we'll try to mitigate for those by putting hatcheries in place. And so every one of the hatcheries in the basin that exists now, and we release tens of millions of hatchery fish, are directly tied or established as mitigation for the dams. For spring, summer Chinook, the adult return goal expected from those hatchery programs is 90,000 fish back to the basin. And we've only met that in a couple of years. Most of the hatchery mitigation programs and the ones tied specific to the Lower Snake Comp program have not met their harvesting objectives. The challenge with doing that broader application of hatcheries is, one, they're not meeting their expectations or promises to date. So I think before you expand that effort, you have to make them operate at the promise level for a portion. And number two is then understanding that implementing hatcheries throughout the basin really isn't practical given the expansiveness and the inaccessibility of the habitat. So you can't do hatcheries in wilderness areas. You just can't get there to collect the fish. You can't get there to release those fish. The performance of those hatchery fish, while we have gotten much better as using them as a conservation tool, don't have the same productivity in every case to the natural production. So treaty rights were based off of natural production, both abundance and distribution. Implementing hatcheries at that distribution scale across all areas just is not practical in that case. And how you do hatchery operations for conservation practices to minimize the genetic impacts, to maintain life history diversity, is something that's effective on a small scale, hard to implement on a large scale that would bring back productivity or production levels, that are the expectation for the region.
Okay. Well, it sounds like I have a little bit better understanding of why that's not necessarily that we can necessarily just do that easily. So that actually kind of brings me to my next question. Is it true that so say if we do like breach dams and replacing energy, would it cost tens of billions of dollars? Because I don't feel like there's a way that we can find the money to replace them, and under any circumstance, right? So even as they increasingly become obsolete.
Well, I think, the cost of breaching and the cost to not to breach, I think, those are the two separate questions that we have here, and what are the cost of to breach. Of course, in Congressman Simpson's proposal, the framework that he laid out, $33.5 billion. And of that, I think a lot of that was for energy, transmission and upgrades to the grid, replacement, renewable energy development, and then, of course, the transportation infrastructure that you'd need to look at, whether it's bridge or rail or highway. And I think those opportunities in transportation and of course, like irrigation too, is another issue that were spelled out in Congressman Simpson's framework that would associate to the cost of $33.5 billion. And I know that through this process that renewable energies would solar, for instance, once installed, their trajectory is a downward trajectory of cost, where hydro will continue to require operation and maintenance of these aging facilities, and what is continuing to grow in the opposite direction. So you have energies that are on two different trajectories there. So I think the actual cost, would be more for continuing to keep the dams and the fish not being able to get back to these numbers that we're looking at for healthy, harvestable, abundant numbers. And a lot of times, that's a moving target for us with energy, is that, we're looking at 2050 goals, the Climate Commitment Act in the state of Washington, what they're looking at wanting to do. So as we continue to move that goalpost around, I think the cost will fluctuate and increase all the time. So, if you don't do that now, we're still in a position to where, salmon, at any cost should not be allowed to go extinct. So, I think the amount of the cost to breaching at this point, the studies are already basically done. They've been doing a lot of studies. The analysis, of course, that is expected out of the governor's proviso in the state of Washington will help answer a lot of the questions that we do have.
Okay, so that actually, you kind of answered, well, not fully answered, but another question that I had regarding energy. Like you mentioned solar power and hydro. So help me help our attendees wrap their heads around this. So an energy source can still be called clean energy, even if it destroys rivers and extinguishes wildlife, right? So that's why the dams are considered to be a clean source, and there's no possible way that their power could ever be replaced by solar or wind energy. Is that correct, or am I understanding that correctly?
Well, I guess, the energies, what the energy future looks like, of course, with renewables, whether it's small modular reactors, solar, battery storage, wind, and battery storage, and what that battery storage looks like, if it's, lithium batteries, or if it's hydrogen cell, which is the next generation of cell technology that's already basically here, but not advanced to the point to where we're able to deploy that commercially at the current point. And so as these new developments come on, I think the energy that's able to replace the dams and provide firm energy to a growing Pacific Northwest and the growing energy needs of the Pacific Northwest, that's a part of the portfolio of energy that we'll need. And hydro plays a role in that. And as we continue to move away from fossil fuel energy, that's coal or natural gas, hydro, it definitely is a carbon-free energy. Well, it's not completely carbon-free. There are generation of carbon in hydro projects, but environmental free, they're not environmentally free, because they burn fish like a coal plant burns coal, natural gas burns gas, and so the amount of fish that are burned in the hydro system is something that puts those hydro systems on the not environmentally free level. And so as we're able to develop energies, development of renewable energies can happen in generally 1 to 3 years. The development of the grid is estimated at 10 to 20 years of upgrading the grid to meet the needs of 2050, and what's expected at that time for the amount of energy that'll be being utilized by the Pacific Northwest. But at the same time, I think, that's what kind of creates this moving target is like, well, you have to create for 2050. Well, right now we need to create for the fish currently, because the fish aren't on the same time clock. They're limited on the amount of time that they have. So development and deployment of renewable energies to replace certain the amounts of energy that are being produced by the lower Snake River dams, which at capacity is the nameplate is 3,500 megawatts. They generally utilize or produce about 1,000 megawatts, and even at other certain times of the year, depending on the amount of water that's in the system, whether it's in the middle of winter or in the heat of the summer when the water is down, those times, that's yet to be determined on how much actual power they can produce at those low water levels. And so the capacity of those dams, are they truly at that 1,000 megawatt level, or can they even produce at the 3,500 megawatt level? So thinking about energy and how we utilize energy, if the sun is shining, we should be definitely utilizing solar. If the wind's blowing, definitely using wind. And these on call, whether it's battery or hydro or small modular reactors, that energy can be called upon instantly as well. So, we need to really relook and rethink of energy usage and when, where, and how we use that. And conservation definitely has to play a big role in energy use. And so, looking at ourselves first and microgrids and development of microgrids throughout the federal facilities, the state facilities, tribal facilities, businesses. They should all be looking at microgrids as well as any other rooftops that are out there for individual households to develop their own microgrids. And I think that conservation piece is the early piece that we can go after in order to remove energy that's needed to be placed onto the grid to supply those homes and that source of power that's being utilized across the Pacific Northwest. So, from a perspective of Nimipu Energy and the work that we're doing there, I think that's really the things that we can see out there that kind of ties into energy. And I know there's a lot more to it than that, but that's just a quick overview of what we're seeing. I didn't know if Jay had anything to add on the amounts of production that the lower four Snake River dams can produce.
Yeah, thanks, Vice Chair. I think you covered some really important concepts in there, that the power generation potential of those dams, or any dam, is tied to the amount of water that is actually coming downstream. And while the nameplate capacity is 3,500 megawatts, rarely is that ever available to reach that power production potential. Right now, current conditions, when flows are starting to increase in the Snake Basin, we have about 60,000 cubic feet per second going down the river over the last couple of days. When we overlay the fish spill operations that are currently in place, that generates about 300 megawatts of energy. It's referred to as Mengen spill the rest. And so as folks are looking for what it takes to keep the lights on, because we don't want to put people at risk and increase that risk of blackouts or those types of things. But right now, we've been able to allocate a fair amount of water to spill for fish to get those downstream and generate 300 megawatts of energy. If we can find ways to replace that, 300 to 900 is kind of 7 to 900 is the average across the year. That's that firm energy level that Vice Chair referenced. And so it's not as daunting as to find replacement that energy that can replace and allow the conversation of breaching those 4 snake dams to move forward.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying. So Washington State recently passed a $70 billion budget that includes $5 million of funding over 2 years to study removing the Snake River dams. But some critics say that the study squanders our hard-earned taxpayer money. Is this funding just a waste? That's pretty much my question.
Well, I don't believe that is it is a waste. I believe that under the Murray-Inslee report and the call for needed analysis of the irrigation systems, the transportation systems, and the energy system, that really putting cost estimates and to those each of those areas that will potentially be affected by breaching, that that's a part of the equation that we need to start solving for. And I the Washington legislators moving that forward and placing that in Governor Inslee's budget to put costs to each of those sectors is very important as we look to the federal government and in the long run to be able to pay for those costs. And from a tribal perspective, Nez Perce perspective that has treaty rights in the Stevens Treaty, there's an obligation to that the federal government has. Governor Inslee, then in 1855, Governor Stevens, this agreement was reached and bargained for, and these fish and these usual and custom areas need to have these fish for that right to exist. The right still exists there with is if there isn't fish there, I guess, then does that right still exist? Yes, it still exists, but that's not what we bargained for. And so I think, Governor Inslee, Senator Murray, they definitely understand the obligation of treaty. Judges understand treaty because they're bound by treaty. Our treaty sits in the Constitution under Article 6, Clause 2. And that obligation, the federal government definitely understands. So if we're setting a cost to replacement energy, replacement of or upgrades to the transportation system, or upgrades to the irrigation system to meet the needs of transforming during breaching and when breaching occurs, that is an obligation that the federal government has to not only to the states to fund projects that will help replace bridges or infrastructure or rail, but also meet the needs of the energy upgrades that need to happen, and to the irrigators to provide funding so that they can make those upgrades to support its efforts in continuing the growth in our agriculture communities, and all at the same time doing what the science says is best for salmon recovery. So basically, NOAA accepting science from the entities that they did, and from Nez Perce, that they're accepting an obligation that they have to the Nez Perce, and the way that the treaty is supposed to work, with two entities on opposite sides of a coin. And that's an obverse relationship that we have, where mutually we benefited from the treaty, but there should not be of these benefits anything that burdens one side or the other. And I believe that where the salmon are currently at, that the United States understands its obligation, that it's burdening the tribes, and we need to do something about it. And I believe that the federal government will fund the analysis that Governor Inslee comes up with, and those entities that are a part of it, whether you're irrigation, whether your transportation or energy, need to be ready for those upgrades and moving forward with transforming the Pacific Northwest to a better, stronger, smarter Pacific Northwest in order to save the salmon. So no, it's definitely not a waste of dollars. It's a move in the right direction and for the future of not only salmon, but for the Pacific Northwest.
Jay, did you have any additional comments? No. Okay, so the time is now 12:47, and I want to thank you for answering. So at this time, I will go ahead and just there are quite a few questions in the Q&A, and so if I'll go ahead and ask, and if you can answer it short, great. If not, we may not get to all of the Q&A from the audience. So the first one says the WDFW in State of Salmon report states that the Snake Fall Chinook are recovering. What are your comments?
So Snake River Fall Chinook are in a different spot than the other species. And so that is encouraging. The natural origin abundance, the average for that is actually higher than the delisting abundance criteria. And so there's been about 10,000 natural origin fish for Snake River Fall Chinook returning. That's a huge turnaround. And that turnaround has been the result of multiple management actions, including supplementation. So Fall Chinook are different than the other species or stocks in the Snake Basin in a couple of ways. And I'll highlight two of those. One is that they are heavily supplemented. So over, between 60 and 70% of the spawners each year are hatchery origin in the Snake River Fall Chinook population. So there's questions of whether that's sustainable without the hatchery program, but we're using that hatchery program in a conservation sense to both benefit natural production and natural origin returns. The other stocks throughout the basin do not have that level of hatchery supplementation occurring, and as we discussed earlier, that's really not feasible to do. The second difference on Fall Chinook is their out migration timing. They have their juveniles go to the ocean really over 12 months of a year, and the majority of those go out later than the spring migrants and go out during the highest spring flows that occur in June. And so they're really riding the coattails of the reduced available water going out of the basin. And then those fish go to slightly different areas in the ocean. So they get impacted by ocean conditions differently than spring Chinook and steelhead. So there are some big differences. We're thankful for those fish coming back. But bottom line is efforts to recover healthy and abundant salmon and steelhead means and applies to all stocks and species. And so we need to account for those nuances. So I highlighted a couple of differences on why Fall Chinook are in a little bit better category condition than the other stocks.
Okay, and then there was another question that I heard you mention ocean. So it says ocean conditions for salmon cycle up and down. What conditions in the ocean are expected for the young fish leaving the Snake Basin this year and next year? And then the second part to that question is it correct to say that worsening ocean conditions due to climate change will probably doom Snake River salmon anyway?
So first question first, the ocean indices for this year's fish are still being collected. However, it looks like the ocean is switching conditions from where it's been at. So we've had some of the best ocean conditions observed, kind of the top 3 or 4 in terms of those indices leading up to this year. That's why we've seen some better returns that we discussed earlier. It looks like we're going to be maybe heading downward in those ocean conditions. So that's not positive. That data is collected by NOAA and on an ocean vessel, so that's to be determined. Second question relative to the ocean conditions are so bad, are the Snake River stocks doomed? And I think the answer to that is no, they're not doomed if we can do some major changes and actions in the freshwater environment. Salmon survival is hinged on a balance of both freshwater conditions and saltwater. Those aren't entirely separate or independent of each other. And so if we can take positive actions in the freshwater environment, that will help buffer and is essential to buffer the poor ocean conditions that we expect in the future going forward. So it's really important that we do everything that we possibly can in that freshwater environment to buffer and provide that resilience to poor ocean conditions.
And just to add to that, Jay, I think, if we can get the freshwater conditions and the ocean conditions to eventually through timing, they would time good conditions in the ocean and a lot better conditions in the freshwater. We think that would definitely spell great returns. As we said before about the high spill conditions and what we're predicting there, continued growth and at least maintaining these fish from going extinct.
Okay, so let's move on to which probably will be our last question. It says, what impacts do hatchery fish have on the fitness of the natural fish?
So that is a complex answer, and it varies based off of each population. We use hatcheries in different roles. Hatcheries can have a net benefit to natural production fish when those hatcheries are operated in a conservation mode. So we have data collected on that in scientific peer-reviewed publications. The Johnson Creek program is an example of that, where we have operated that to the benefit of the natural population. There are examples where hatcheries can be a detriment for various reasons to natural production, and we have tried to minimize those here in the Snake Basin. There are still some examples of poor or hatchery practices that need to change in some areas throughout the Columbia. But for the Snake Basin, most of those are aligned with conservation principles. There are some questions about carrying capacity and the amount of hatchery origin fish and the competition that might occur when the juveniles get to the ocean. And in those types of situations, I go back to kind of common sense and understanding the magnitude of what was here historically and not constraining our expectations and pointing fingers to those hatchery programs. So that's a much longer discussion and complexities on how we manage those, but we really try to use hatcheries in different ways and not have a detrimental impact to the natural production in the Snake Basin. I think we have a pretty good structure of how to do that and balancing harvest augmentation with conservation principles.
Okay, so actually, I just realized that I do have time for one more question. So I apologize for the juke out there. So if dams are the most degrading factors to the habitats of endangered wild salmon, shouldn't they be more severely mitigated under the ESA and treaty mandates?
Go ahead, Jay, and I'll follow up with you.
I think the short answer is that ESA has a different standard than healthy and abundant. ESA principles and the impacts of like the dams has been measured against a jeopardy standard, not against their limiting factor to healthy and abundant. And the tribe has been very active in challenging that concept. Use some of my prompt water here. So knowing what you're measuring against in terms of success and impacts is really important in that discussion. ESA structures have not been assessed against achieving healthy and abundant. That needs to change. I think that discussion is changing in the basin. And so taking the actions or looking at the impacts relative to their limitations to healthy and abundant is really the lens that we should be looking through, not the impacts of the dams jeopardizing future existence, or, you know, can they keep fish from going extinct?
Thank you, Jay, for that. And I think you answered a lot of that question there. The part with treaty for me and my understanding of treaty is responsibilities and what roles the federal government plays and fish managers, and what role the tribe plays in this as well. So the tribe is more than just a fish manager. Tribe, and then you have to look at the treaty aspect of this and what was going on at the time of treaty. So if we're looking and speaking to the time of treaty and what the Nez Perce were actually doing at the treaty grounds, the Nez Perce were actually administering and granting the right of passage through our countries and utilization of a river system to the United States of America. So in essence, we granted that right to the United States. So we were administering the waterway for that purpose. And to put it into a legal context of understanding that the Nez Perce would have understood what we were signing at the time. There are depictions of Nez Perce taking notes, writing, reading, understanding the full extent of what we were agreeing to and what we were bargaining for. So a true administration of fisheries, of the fisheries, is something that the tribe, from my perspective, is something that the tribe has. We have a right to administer fisheries, which then is the right to set the numbers of healthy, harvestable, abundant numbers of natural spawners coming back. And so as we look at it from that context and understanding on, you know, just simple law of canons of construction, you would have had to understand, interpret as the Indians would have understood it at the time. And for us, we could read and write. We could understand that we were agreeing to, we were allowing this to happen, and we were administering a right. And so that administration of that right still exists today. And so when the Nez Perce say healthy, harvestable, abundant numbers, regaining those populations to that's an administration right that the Nez Perce have.
Okay, well, thank you, Shannon and Jay, for answering the questions on short notice from the audience. And I just want to take the time to thank all of our audience members for submitting questions and answers. Also for Jay and Shannon for joining us today. Our next speaker series will be Wednesday, May 24th. So please keep a lookout for the flyers. I have on your screen, you should see all of our contacts. If you could please like and follow us on social media, as well as the Salmon Orca Project. And you'll be able to find out more information. And these are recorded, so and should be available on those pages for you. Anyways, I just want to say thank you one more time, and we will end there. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.